Good afternoon. My article written this weekend is called COVID-19 and the Spillover Moment. Let me start with some comments from Albert Camus' La Peste. They fancied themselves free, wrote Camus, and no one will ever be free so long as there are pestilences. In this respect, our townsfolk were like everybody else, wrapped up in themselves. In other words, they were humanists. They disbelieved in pestilences. A pestilence isn't a thing made to man's measure. Therefore, we tell ourselves that a pestilence is a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that will pass away. But it doesn't always pass away, and from one bad dream to another, it is men who pass away, and the humanists first of all, because they have taken no precautions. We are now trending in the 80,000 to 100,000 COVID cases a day now. We have crossed 4 million cases. This is a chart from Our World in Data to give you a sense of where we are now. And the winners are easy to see. This is from Balagis, and essentially how they beat COVID: early common sense action, don't wait for more data or results from complicated models, and that speaks to the speed of propagation. A virus moves fastest of all, even at warp speed. Isolate away from home, set up facilities to isolate an infected family member away from the rest, strong lockdown, strict travel restrictions, even within the country, massive testing, face masks for everyone. The stricter these are, the shorter the lockdown. So you see Vietnam, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, Austria, amongst others. And you see those countries which have failed to win here: the US, the UK, and Sweden are three examples. The developed world, with the exception of the US, has bent the curve. The European trend is down. This is from May 6th via Remy GMI. In Europe, the number of daily cases is decreasing. And we're now witnessing a spillover into emerging markets and frontier geographies. Brazil is probably the global epicenter of the coronavirus now. In Brazil, we have a toxic mix of a voodoo president, Jair Bolsonaro, and a runaway COVID. I remember that comment he made: Brazilians aren't infected by anything, even when they fall into a sewer, he said. It's tragic surrealism. I can't stop thinking about Gabriel Garcia Marquez when I think about the situation Manaus is facing. That was from The Guardian, which had this extraordinary photograph of burials. And apparently over the weekend, Bolsonaro was riding a jet ski, whilst at the same time COVID-19 death toll topped 10,000. Brazil has a population of 210 million and reached 10,627 deaths after 730 fatalities were recorded overnight. Cases 155,939. Viruses are in essence non-linear, exponential and multiplicative, and the COVID-19 has escape velocity in Brazil. The real has got crushed, touched a record low of 5.884 on May the 7th. That chart is from Jamie McGeever. And Brazil remains a real-time laboratory experiment. And the African Jair Bolsonaro is, of course, President Magufuli of Tanzania. According to the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Tanzania has conducted just 652 tests as of 7th May. That compares to 26,000 here in Kenya and nearly 45,000 in Uganda. BRICS ex-China is accelerating, as you can see from this COVID-19 tracker list, Vivek M. Official. USA, of course, has the highest number of cases, Spain second, Italy, UK fourth. But look at this, Russia is now fifth with just shy of 200,000 cases, Brazil 156,000, Turkey 137,000, and you can see India at 62,808. Saudi Arabia is up there at 37,000. So this is what I'm speaking about when I'm saying it's spilling out of the developed world. Stephen B. Streeter, who I follow on Twitter, hot countries, more than 10% is Mayotte, which is a French territory and has not been relaxed by the French. Above 5%, Russia, Brazil, Mexico, Pakistan, Qatar, Dominican Republic, South Africa, Egypt, Kuwait, Bahrain, Ghana, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Azerbaijan, Bolivia, Senegal, Somalia, DR Congo, Guatemala. And the day before, above 10% was Ghana, Honduras, Sudan. So again, reiterating that spillover point I'm making. Looking at Africa, WHO has warned of 190,000 deaths in Africa, saying that the pandemic could smolder in Africa for several years should the various lockdowns currently being eased in many African countries fail to bend the curve. Between 29 and 44 million Africans risk being infected, with deaths potentially reaching 190,000. Charlie Robertson's done some analysis on the demographic profile, and because the African population is much younger, he is implying even fewer deaths than WHO. WHO believe that transmissions will likely be slower because of Africa's age pyramid and social and environmental factors, the pandemic risks lasting for far longer. While COVID-19 likely won't spread as exponentially in Africa as it has already in the world, it's likely it will smolder in transmission hotspots, says Dr. Matshidiso Moeti, who's the regional director for WHO for Africa. COVID-19 could become a fixture in our lives for the next several years unless a proactive approach is taken by many governments in the region. We need to test, trace, isolate, and treat, she said. The last count, and this is obviously out of date now, 56,000 confirmed cases on the African continent, with far more than 19,100 associated recoveries and 2,100 deaths. The worrying development for me is around transmission hotspots. Kano in Nigeria, for example, has seen a surge in cases and deaths. Western Cape in South Africa is growing at an alarming rate. This is from Sugan 250388, 7-day rolling average of new cases in South Africa for each province as of May 8. Cases, according to her, not growing fast enough in Limpopo and Northwest and Northern Cape to include them, but have a look at the Western Cape numbers, which are effectively off the charts. This is a photograph of the Western Cape from Getty Images. And then we've got this unique Bolsonaro-like situation in Tanzania. Tanzania sought to discredit Tanzanian lab results. President Magufuli says a papaya tested positive for corona. He also tested a goat and a Franklin bird, David Pilling reported. The president told us to go back to work and pray, and then he got on his private presidential jet, went to his home village, Chateau, and left us to it, said Fatima Karume, a lawyer and activist in Dar es Salaam. Someone with close knowledge, this is from the Financial Times article, of the medical profession said it was almost impossible to secure a hospital bed in several cities. The Aga Khan hospital in Dar es Salaam had a well-equipped ward for 80 coronavirus patients, but several were dying each night, this article reported. And the question for sub-Saharan Africa is whether these transmission hotspots expand and conflate. And that's still an open question. Let's turn to the financial markets. America lost so many jobs in April that we could barely fit the numbers in this chart of historic downturns, and that includes all of the Great Recession. That's from Business Insider. To give you a scale, to give you a sense of scale and speed of this downturn, it's really unprecedented. And then you have this dichotomy where if you look at the unemployment rate, compare it to stocks, and Tabby Costa has done an example of that, you can see there's this enormous divergence. The stock market has performed very well. And for example, last week the Fed funds rate went negative for June 2021, which is a remarkable and never seen before thing. We are, I believe, in the realm of behavioral economics. The governments can say we're switching it back on, but if nobody wants to go to work or go into a cinema, it's not going to have much effect. For example, I came across a tweet from Melissa Beth. I had a clinically mild case for 8+ weeks. There was nothing mild about it, she said. And therefore, we've got to look at individuals and see how they're going to react. And I'm not convinced that they're going to react at the same speed as some of the governments might want them to react. Essentially, tourism, I believe, is stopped out. I initially said for the whole of this year, but I think it's stopped out essentially for the whole of next year as well. This is a photograph of my daughter learning to surf in Diani, which is a beautiful beach to visit, but is largely shuttered now. Business travel is toast. I think, with Zoom and Skype and WhatsApp, I think a lot of folks are going to avoid it entirely. For tourism dependency, this is a chart from Trinomics. Places like the Maldives, British Virgin Islands, Macau, Aruba, Seychelles, the Bahamas, Vanuatu, Cabo Verde, St. Lucia, Belize top 10 in terms of percentage of import into GDP. But, there are many other countries that have a substantial tourism income, which is at zero. Saudi Arabia, for example, with the Hajj, India, Kenya, there are plenty of countries. Deutsche Bank, our global forecast has turned decidedly gloomier. Much of the world has struggled mightily with the virus and the economic fallout. We now see global GDP falling 10% in Q2 and remaining well below pre-virus levels through most of next year. That speaks to that previous article when I said what's certain is that the whole global economy has been hit by an insidious, literally invisible circuit breaker. Okay, the US stock market has rebounded mightily, but in my view, this is a Venezuela or a Zimbabwe trade. And don't take offense, let me explain what I mean. This chart is from Adam Mancini. With the money printer now on at full steam, and essentially people now worrying about the devaluation of the dollar. It's not happening yet because of the unique situation we're in, where there is such an enormous demand for the dollar, but that's not going to remain the case if you continue at this pace of printing. So the stock market has become like a safe haven, like it has in Venezuela and in Zimbabwe. In Zimbabwe, of course, we had that unique situation of $100 trillion. There was actually a currency for that. So as I'm saying, it's all about the print shop. Scott Berg put out that wonderful tweet with a print shop. Some folks dived into Bitcoin, which topped 10,000 on Friday, but is now back below 9,000. Raul, who I follow and who called negative rates a while back when it was an unthinkable thing, is talking about the perfect wedge. If you use classic charting techniques, it gives you a price target of around $40,000. And, you know, he could be right. The thing is, Bitcoin is pretty unique in the sense that it could go anywhere. But Paul Tudor Jones, very renowned trader, the best profit maximizing strategy is to own the fastest horse, he said. In a market outlook note he entitled The Great Monetary Inflation, what I was talking about earlier. If I am forced to forecast, my bet is it will be Bitcoin Jones, who said his Tudor BVI fund may hold as much as a low single-digit percentage of its assets in Bitcoin futures. It becomes one of the first big hedge fund managers to embrace what until now has largely been snubbed by the financial mainstream. Nuriel tweeted, Bitcoin crashes by 15% in 7 minutes on no news, a rigged, totally manipulated, Wales-controlled market where most transactions, 90% volumes are false as exchanges pretend to have liquidity they don't have, massive pump and dump, spoofing, front-running, wash trading, total scam. So you take your pick. Crude oil has rebounded. Will it last? Of course it won't. Where will it stall is the question. The drop in worldwide oil consumption in April has been put as high as 35 million barrels a day. And I think, you know, we might narrow that gap next month and the following month, but we're going to see a very significant reduction, something the oil producers can't simply keep up with. This is, now let's turn to Africa. This is from under the radar, a map of population density in Africa, which I liked. And as I was thinking over the weekend, I thought to myself, Africa will go Juche. Juche, and I can't pronounce it in Korean, usually left untranslated or is translated as self-reliance, is the official ideology of North Korea, described by the government as Kim Il-sung's original, brilliant and revolutionary contribution to national and international thought, otherwise known as autarky, but I prefer the Korean-sounding Juche. I think, you know, the IMF has put some money to work, but it is a band-aid. This is an image of the 10 biggest African recipients of the IMF's emergency coronavirus funding. Nigeria obviously got the biggest slug. Amidst the COVID-19 shock, lower commodity prices and regional dependence on tourism and remittances will push current accounts in most sub-Saharan African countries into deficit. This is from IIF. And when you look at that, you can see the scale of the meltdown is pretty enormous. The outliers are already rolling over. Africa Confidential is reporting Zambia is on the brink of sovereign default, but I was alerting you to that from last year, if not before. The government is getting no help from the IMF because it won't stop borrowing unsustainably and covertly. After stopping payments on several commercial loans this year, Zambia is set to default on its $3 billion of Eurobonds, now trading at distressed debt levels with yields over 50%, Africa Confidential has learned. Ratings agencies are throwing in the towel. They tend to be behind the curve. That's the nature of the game. Another devaluation looms as the Naira depreciates in the forwards market, now at 570 Naira to 1. Dropped 27% last week. That's 5-year onshore non-deliverable forward contract. The 1-year non-deliverable forward contract was down 5% from 394 to close at 421, a price differential of 26.93. And I think a final conclusion is that, regime implosion risk in sub-Saharan Africa, like in many parts of the world, is continuing to trend higher. Thank you for listening.